Principles of Finance, a la Shmup. The nitty and the gritty. All right, people, the headlines fly the day, quote, everything, unquote, is announced. This is your banker, Max McMission. He represented Blade Runner, and now he's the star banker in his firm, having just generated a 2% commission on the $600 million sale, or $12 million a nanodrone for his bank. His costs? Maybe $1 million if you include everything. There was just Max and 3 junior bankers. None of them make big salaries, maybe $1 million a year in total for all 4. But just based on this deal, Max stands to make maybe 5 times his salary in bonus money this year. Yeah, this deal alone would generally grant him about 20% of its revenues to the bank, and he'd get a key to the executive washroom, one with padded reclining toilet seats. So yeah, he'll make quite a few $1 million this year. He'll actually be justified in whining about taxes. Well, what did he do to earn this whineability? Well, as lead banker or managing director of his group, he'll have fielded myriad detaily questions about every little nugget of the transaction, let alone having held the hand and or any other body part needing holding of his nervous CEO who is risking his career in making this deal happen. The questions were loaded. What will the street think? Will management teams click? Does he want to own stock in the new company? At what price? What are the tax implications to shareholders? Who's on the new board? What are the real cost savings and revenue synergies in the merged companies? Yeah, that's how Wall Street people talk. And ding, 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 it was the math behind that marriage that sold the deal. Got the transaction to happen, earned Max's bank the $12 million sweet loving commission dollars, payable at close in cash. Thank you very much. Well, there are really 2 types of capital spend in the world. That is, companies spend big bucks for 2 key things: expansion and replacement. And there's the stalwart old tractor factory that was built while helicopters were bombing Vietnam to Wagner music. She still runs, but well, she pollutes a lot, needs a ton of oil and human labor. Injuries happen at least to one person each month, and makes a basic tractor cost $30,000 to produce. Her upgraded brand spanking new sister factory would cost $80 million to build, but would let you make tractors for $20,000. Not pollute, not injure people, and generally run with way less risk of mechanical failure and downtime. Well, the factory replacement question then begs the Clint Eastwood question: is it worth it? Do you feel lucky, punk? That's replacement capital, replacing a factory. But then there's expansion capital, and it's a bit of a new beast. In this case, you're focused on using capital to play offense, i.e. to buy more revenues, as weird as that sounds, versus playing defense, i.e. to fix a dying tractor smelting plant. Well, the main idea here is that the big swing factor in making a deal happen, having it make sense for both sides, is that the incremental cash profits generated by the combined company more than pay for the grief, hassle, dilution, transaction costs, and so on of putting the 2 companies together. And because debt is so often a key element when companies merge, that is, the buyer rarely wants to use all stock because doing so would dilute them meaningfully, the focus then is on cash profits, or just cash flow generated by the new behemoth. Cash profits, think free cash flow, cash earnings. Okay, some rough math and the gist here. If we can borrow money at 5% and buy something with 10% kind of returns for a long foreseeable future, well, why wouldn't we? Like, we make a 5% a year, quote, spread, unquote, against that deal, and if that sounds sort of like the way a bank works, well, in a way it is. Banks borrow at, say, 3% and sell 30-year mortgages at some flavor here and there of 6%, and they live nicely for decades on that 3% spread. There's a reason that banks have such nice jets. Well, the challenges in doing the math obviously come when there's a lot of risk in the deal, or when the price is so high that the return is 5.5% against the 5% cost of borrowing. And then there comes in strategic deals or strategic rationale of why you'd want to do this deal of hidden value, like brand equity and future sales and heft in negotiating with retailers, stuff like that. At only 0.5% gain, well, most deals are just not worth the risk of then doing. So how does this merger magic happen anyway? Why are there so many mergers in the world, and how are there apparently so many fat or redundant job mirrors that go away when the companies merge, saving shareholders huge amounts of money. Well, we whisper, firings. Yeah, people get fired. The reality is that in the case of two drone companies coming together, for example, each company probably has a dozen workers on either side who do nothing but buy component parts like blades and drone housing and paint and decals and wires and computer chips and so on. Well, in a combined company, only one set of these buyers is needed, usually. Usually one company is much more automated than the other. Blade Runner relies heavily on robots for building stuff, so they take 2.3 man-hours to assemble a drone. Nanodrone used to use much cheaper labor. In Latin America, labor is cheaper, and that was what was building their drones, so they weren't robotically savvy or even interested in spending that capital to build robot assembly plants. But under Blade Runner's system, well, they can likely get rid of lots of laborers and improve margins. In the old days, downsizing like this was easy. There's a consulting firm, a famous one, called McKinsey. They used to be this awesome place that companies could turn to in the transition of America into a globally competitive corporate marketplace. In the 1930s, not many companies were actually public. Most of America was run in family fiefdoms with private, unschooled managers who, frankly, just weren't that good. And how good could we really expect crazy Uncle Larry to be when it came to optimizing 400 inputs in a giant linear regression model? Larry came from product procurement. Well, he was buddies with basically everyone and didn't know math, nor did he take this course. So he was screwed. But more importantly, the company was screwed. And if they didn't run competitively versus the rest of the quickly modernizing, electronicizing, computerizing world, well, the company would go bankrupt and everyone then would end up being out of work. So the systems of buying, building, and selling had to be completely redone, modernized with professional management and math. Well, Uncle Larry had to be fired. The only question was, how? Answer? Call McKinsey. And that was McKinsey's raison d'etre for half a century as it became the fall guy for bad news, typically for mediocre family member managers who had to be fired. And it also covered when entire divisions had to be cut, or at least cut in half. McKinsey's core skill was math. It had all the data. It totally knew how to use it, like it knew that the competitor, Joe Blow's tractor company, served the same number of tractor smelting molds, and it did it with half the number of employees. So they could point to Joe from Uncle Larry's chair and say, well, how come he does it twice as good as you do? McKinsey would have studied the reasons for such improved efficiency, produced a bunch of pretty pie charts, and then given Uncle Larry an easy exit stage left. Well, McKinsey called this practice, quote, strategic consulting, and they could demand huge fees for doing it. And then much of the world grew efficient. So today, McKinsey is a shadow of its former self as being a key player in American business. People who have to call McKinsey to help them consult and fix things generally are the people on the losing side of corporate America, like Google and Netflix and Facebook ain't exactly calling McKinsey. But the consulting firm's history is rich, like its old partners, the ones who cashed out. Yeah. Blade Runner and Nanodrone have now merged. What time is it? Tricked you. No, it's not example time. It's cost-saving time, aka firing time. Well, Nanodrone had 22 people in marketing. Blade Runner had 40. The combined companies need maybe 50. So boom, 12 bodies. Well, at $100,000 a year each with everything, like their salaries are 70 and benefits, pension, office, all that crap's another 30. So it cost the company about $100,000 a year to employ them. That's $1.2 million in savings right away off the bat. Then Nanodrone had 30 lawyers, secretaries, security people, and accountants. Only a dozen would need to be kept, and boom again, another $2 million more saved. What about parts? Well, Nanodrone was paying 20% more for its plastic than Blade Runner because, well, it did a lot less volume. So under Blade Runner's volume discount deals, more savings. Boom, fixed. Oh, and batteries? Blade Runner has brand spanking new plant, and that makes them really good batteries. Boom, more cost savings. Lather, rinse, repeat, and suddenly $6 million of immediate cash annual savings are found in the merger. But an even cooler thing happens with Nanodrone under the wing of Blade Runner's distribution force. Nanodrone no longer has to beg for retail shelf space. So instead of keeping only 40% of their higher-end $400 sale or $160, now they get 50% or $200. Boom, yet again, more revenues for free. That's $40 more per unit times, and wait, Blade Runner has a hugely trafficked website. They load Nanodrone Nanodrone onto it, and suddenly Nanodrone sales tick up 30%. Boom and anti-boom. Nanodrone notes that its growth rate declines by about 10% in the midst of all this shelf shaking. Why? Well, remember cannibalization? Yeah, this, not this. Yeah, Nanodrone's getting gobbled by Blade Runner. Well, if not gobbled, nibbled a little bit anyway. And the key here is to just get the gist that an acquirer can sometimes pay what seems like a huge multiple premium, in this case 20 times revenues of $30 million and no earnings, only to find that under the scale and leverage of the acquirer revenues, which would have grown to 60 million on their own, say, well, then under the acquisition they grow to, 100 million. And costs, instead of being 45 million at that point, become just 30. So 3 years later, the acquired company goes from being independent with, 15 million of pre-tax free cash flow on 60 million of revenues to being a subsidiary of a bigger company with 150 million of revenues and 70 million of pre-tax cash flow. So when Blade Runner paid that, quote, outrageous, unquote, and even laughed at by the industry price of $600 million to buy Nanodrone, in hindsight, a few years later, it will look back and realize that it will only have paid about 9 times pre-tax free cash flow. Super cheap for a property like this and a global brand maker for the category. Whatever drone company is in second place is in vastly distant second place now. Blade Runner Nanodrone is the bomb.com.